The moment of execution had arrived. Thraxus Vorn, chief executioner of the Galactic Corrective Rehabilitation Command, stood with ceremonial rigidity as he prepared to read the sentence. His three hearts pulsed in perfect synchronized rhythm, a trait the Sthakral species took immense pride in, emotional regulation being the cornerstone of their 17,000-year civilization. Prisoner 7724B, Thraxus announced through his ventilation slits, designated Earth name Daniel Roberts. You have been found guilty of trespassing in a Class 1 restricted zone, tampering with a planetary development archive, unauthorized communication with a pre-contact species, and... He paused for dramatic effect, his left eye stalk swiveling. To observe the human's reaction, consumption of sanctified algal nutrients from the diplomatic buffet without proper clearance documentation. The human stood in the hovering restraint field, appearing infuriatingly relaxed despite the gravity of his situation. Daniel Roberts, tall by human standards but unremarkable by galactic ones, had a perpetual half-smile that the Sthakral interpretation algorithm classified as insolent amusement. His prison jumpsuit, bright orange as per galactic standard for condemned beings, hung loosely on his frame. The sentence, as prescribed by Intergalactic Statute 47B, is planetary rehabilitation duty. Thraxus paused, allowing his gill flaps to flutter with satisfaction. You will be transported to the death world Kl'hax, where you will serve as a planetary tamer until either the biosphere becomes Class 3 habitable or you expire, whichever comes first. The court chamber, filled with representatives from 17 planetary systems, rippled with a wave of appendage tapping, the galactic equivalent of appreciative applause. Sending criminals to death worlds was considered both efficient punishment and practical resource management. Daniel Roberts cleared his throat. Quick question, do I get weekends off? The translator implanted in the collar around his neck rendered his words in standard galactic, but somehow failed to remove what the Sthakral perceived as inappropriate levity. Thraxus's eye stalks stiffened in annoyance. Silence. The criminal does not speak during sentencing. Thraxus adjusted his ceremonial execution robe, which was actually quite uncomfortable around his tertiary breathing vents. As is tradition, you are permitted one statement before transportation. Make it brief. Daniel scratched his chin, looking thoughtful in a way that suggested he wasn't taking any of this seriously. Well, I'd like to thank the Academy, my agent, and of course my pet goldfish, Bubbles, who always believed in me. The courtroom fell into confused silence. The Zexreal ambassador leaned over to the hegemony representative and whispered, "What is this Academy? Is it a terrorist organization?" The translator algorithms struggled to process the cultural reference, eventually flagging it as ceremonial, Earth humor with no tactical significance. Thraxus Vorn slammed his ceremonial staff against the floor, the crystalline tip shattering as it always did during executions, a tradition dating back millennia that now mainly served to annoy the custodial drones. Enough! Prepare the prisoner for immediate transport to Kl'hax. The transport ship Relentless Bureaucracy lurched through subspace, its aging engines protesting against the strain of maintaining quantum cohesion. In the prisoner hold, Daniel Roberts sat on a bench made of some material that somehow managed to be both uncomfortably hard and disturbingly spongy at the same time. Across from him, his escort, a Vraxian security officer named Morga Thiel, monitored him with 4 of her 6 eyes while the other 2 focused on a data tablet. Vraxians were insectoid in appearance, with chitinous exoskeletons the color of burnished copper and mandibles that clicked when they spoke. "You are remarkably calm for one sentence to a death world," Morga observed, her voice a series of clicks and whistles that Daniel's translator rendered into slightly stilted English. Daniel shrugged, leaning back against the bulkhead. "Not my first rodeo." "The translator fails to process this idiom," Morga replied, mandibles twitching in irritation. "Please communicate in standard." "It means I've been in tough situations before," Daniel explained. "Besides, Death World sounds dramatic. What's so deadly about it?" Morga's antennae quivered, a sign of disbelief or possibly indigestion. Daniel wasn't entirely sure. Kl'hax has an atmosphere of methane and hydrogen sulfide. Surface temperatures fluctuate between -70 and +120 degrees on your Celsius scale. Indigenous life forms include acidic fungal colonies that can dissolve exoskeletons in seconds and predatory gas bladder organisms that hunt by sound. The longest any prisoner has survived is 7 rotations. Rotations? Planetary days. Ah, Daniel nodded thoughtfully. And I'm supposed to make this place habitable? That is the theoretical objective, yes. Morga's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. In practice, your assignment is a death sentence with the statistically insignificant possibility of redemption. The Galactic Council finds this arrangement morally satisfying. Daniel scratched the back of his neck where the translator collar chafed against his skin. Will I have any equipment, tools, a welcome basket? You will be provided. With a standard-issue planetary tamer kit, Morga responded, tapping at her data tablet. It includes atmospheric analysis tools, basic geological survey equipment, seed samples for 17 oxygen-producing plants, and a Class 2 emergency shelter. What about weapons? Food? The kit contains nutrient packets sufficient for 30 rotations. As for weapons, Morga's 4 primary eyes blinked in sequence. The Council does not provide implements of violence to criminals. You would only harm yourself or damage the ecosystem further. How thoughtful of them, Daniel muttered. The ship lurched suddenly, causing Morga to grasp at her restraints with her secondary limbs. The overhead lights flickered, bathing the hold in an eerie purple glow before stabilizing. We are approaching the Kl'hax system, she announced. Prepare yourself for atmospheric entry. It is typically uncomfortable for your species. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Define uncomfortable. The last human we transported described it as having one's internal organs rearranged by an enthusiastic but incompetent butcher while simultaneously being set on fire. Charming. He expired 17 minutes after deployment. Daniel sighed, closing his eyes. You know, for a supposedly advanced galactic civilization, your criminal rehabilitation methods seem a bit medieval. Morga's antennae twitched again. The Galactic Council has determined that a 0.03% success rate in planetary taming is more resource efficient than maintaining incarceration facilities. It is simple mathematics. Yeah, Daniel said, tightening his jumpsuit straps as the ship began to shake violently. Math was never my strong suit either. The drop pod resembled nothing so much as a metallic coffin with thrusters, which Daniel found grimly appropriate. As the relentless bureaucracy positioned itself in orbit around the sickly yellow-green sphere of Kl'hax, Morga Thiel completed the final preparations for his deployment. This atmospheric suit is rated for 72 hours in Class 4 toxic environments, she explained, helping him into a bulky garment that looked like it had been designed by someone with only a theoretical understanding of human anatomy. The helmet connects here, she demonstrated with efficient clicks of her mandibles, and the oxygen recycler activates automatically. Daniel fumbled with the unfamiliar clasps. And after 72 hours, you will have ideally established your emergency shelter and begun atmospheric processing. Morga handed him a compact metal cube approximately the size of a microwave oven. This is your planetary tamer kit. The user manual is included. Let me guess, it's not in English. It is in standard galactic, with helpful pictograms. Morga's mandibles formed what might have been a smile, if insect mandibles could smile. The previous human complained about this as well, before the methane liquefied his lungs. You really know how to motivate a guy, Daniel muttered, securing the kit to his suit's utility belt. A harsh buzzing sound filled the preparation chamber as red lights began to flash. Morga guided Daniel toward the drop pod with surprising gentleness. It is time. The deployment window is optimal for landing in the least hostile region of the northern hemisphere. As Daniel climbed awkwardly into the pod, Morga hesitated, then extended a data chip. This is unauthorized, but it contains additional information about Kl'hax that may prove useful. Previous expedition notes, geological surveys, and survival recommendations. Daniel blinked in surprise. Why would you help me? Morga's antennae drooped slightly. I have escorted 73 beings to Kl'hax. None have survived. It becomes psychologically taxing. Daniel took the chip, slipping it into a pocket on his suit. Thanks. I'll send you a postcard if I make it. I do not understand this reference, but I acknowledge your sentiment. Morga stepped back and raised a limb in what appeared to be a salute. The Vraxian farewell tradition states, "May your molecules disperse with purpose." Back at you, Daniel replied as the pod's door sealed with a pneumatic hiss. The countdown began, the pod's internal systems chirping in an alien language. Daniel couldn't understand. He braced himself against the padded interior as the floor beneath him opened, revealing the swirling toxic atmosphere of Kl'hax below. Here goes nothing, he whispered to himself as the pod disengaged and plummeted toward the surface. The descent was every bit as uncomfortable as Morga had warned. Daniel felt as though his skeleton was trying to separate itself from his flesh as the pod tore through the upper atmosphere. The temperature inside rose alarmingly despite the cooling system's valiant efforts, and sweat poured down his face inside the helmet. Through the small viewport, he caught glimpses of his new home, vast plains of what appeared to be black sand, punctuated by formations of jagged crystalline structures that jutted from the surface like the teeth of some enormous beast. Yellow-green, clouds of toxic gas swirled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the atmosphere itself was a living entity observing his arrival. The landing thrusters engaged automatically, slowing his descent from terminal to merely terrifying. The pod struck the surface with enough force to rattle Daniel's teeth, bounced once, twice, and then skidded to a halt in a spray of obsidian sand. For several minutes, Daniel remained motionless, uncertain if the creaking sounds he heard were the pod cooling down or his own bones protesting their rough treatment. Finally, the door released with a depressurizing hiss, and the alien world waited to greet its newest inhabitant. "Welcome to Kl'hax," Daniel muttered to himself, peering out at the hostile landscape. "Try not to die on the first day." Stepping onto the surface of Kl'hax felt like walking on a combination of glass shards and quicksand. The black particulate matter shifted treacherously beneath Daniel's boots, occasionally revealing glimpses of something luminescent beneath, a geological feature or perhaps some form of subterranean life. The sky above was a nauseating swirl of yellow-green clouds, occasionally split by electrical discharges that resembled lightning, but moved with disturbing slowness, as if time itself functioned differently here. Daniel activated his suit's environmental scanner, watching as it analyzed the immediate surroundings. The readout confirmed what he already knew. The atmosphere was predominantly methane and hydrogen sulfide, with trace elements of compounds his scanner couldn't even identify. The temperature hovered at a relatively mild -20 Celsius, though the scanner warned of rapid temperature fluctuations predicted within the next few hours. "Charming place," Daniel remarked to himself, his voice sounding hollow inside his helmet. "I can see why it's not in the galactic tourism brochures." He trudged through the black sand toward a relatively flat area about 100 meters from his landing site, dragging the planetary tamer kit behind him. The box, despite its compact appearance, weighed considerably more than expected, or perhaps it was just the planet's slightly higher gravity making itself known. Reaching what seemed like a suitable location, Daniel set down the kit and pressed his palm against the recognition pad. The box hummed briefly, then unfolded itself with mechanical precision, components sliding and locking into place until what had been a simple cube transformed into a workstation with various instruments and compartments. "Okay, let's see what we're working with," Daniel muttered, examining the control panel. The interface illuminated with symbols in Standard Galactic, which his translator collar rendered into hovering English text, visible only to him, a feature he hadn't known. It possessed. The first menu offered 4 options: shelter deployment, environmental analysis, resource survey, and emergency protocols. Shelter first, I think. Daniel selected the appropriate option, then stepped back as a secondary compartment in the kit opened. What emerged was a compressed package roughly the size of a sleeping bag. According to the instructions that scrolled across his field of vision, he needed to place it on level ground and activate the expansion sequence. Daniel followed the directions, placing the package in the center of the flat area and pressing his thumb against another recognition pad. The package shuddered, then began to expand with alarming speed. Within minutes, what had been a compact bundle unfurled into a dome-shaped structure approximately 4 meters in diameter. The material, some kind of translucent polymer, hardened upon exposure to the atmosphere, creating a rigid shell that the instructions assured him could withstand temperatures from -100 to +200 Celsius, as well as most forms of environmental corrosion. An airlock formed on one side of the dome, extending an invitation that Daniel gratefully accepted. He stepped inside the small chamber, waited as it cycled through a decontamination sequence that involved, disconcertingly, bright pulses of violet light, and then entered the main shelter. The interior was Spartan but functional: a sleeping platform, a compact food preparation area, a hygiene station that looked woefully inadequate for human anatomy, and a central console that appeared to control the shelter's systems. The air inside smelled artificially clean, with an undertone of something vaguely citrus-like. Daniel removed his helmet, taking an experimental breath. The air was breathable, if somewhat thin, like being at high altitude on Earth. He felt a momentary wave of dizziness, then his body adjusted. "Home sweet home," he said, setting his helmet on the console. "Now to figure out how I'm supposed to tame an entire planet." He returned to the kit outside, quickly bringing the essential components into the shelter before the scanner warned of an approaching temperature spike. Just as he secured the airlock, the external sensors registered a sudden jump from -20 to +60 Celsius, a 100-degree temperature swing in less than 5 minutes. Through the translucent dome, Daniel watched as the black sand began to ripple and shift, releasing plumes of greenish vapor that joined the toxic clouds above. In the distance, one of the crystalline formations shattered with an audible crack, fragments flying in all directions like shrapnel. 72-hour suit rating wouldn't have gotten me very far, Daniel observed, suddenly grateful for Morga's intervention. Without the shelter, he'd have been dead within the first day. He turned his attention to the central console, activating the environmental analysis program. A holographic display materialized above the console, showing a 3-dimensional model of the surrounding terrain extending approximately 1 kilometer in each direction. The analysis revealed several interesting features. A depression 200 meters north that contained some form of liquid, composition unknown but highly acidic. A network of caverns beneath the surface that appeared to be home to the bioluminescent organisms he'd glimpsed earlier. And most intriguingly, a regular geometric structure approximately 800 meters to the east that the scanner flagged as anomalous, possible artificial construction. Daniel zoomed in on this last feature, frowning thoughtfully. "That's not supposed to be here. Kl'hax is uninhabited, or so they told me." He checked the time. The planet rotated quickly, giving it a day-night cycle of approximately 14 Earth hours. According to the shelter's chronometer, local night would fall in about 3 hours. The temperature would likely plummet again, perhaps to levels even lower than when he arrived. First order of business, survival, Daniel decided. Second, figure out what that structure is. And somewhere along the way maybe start this whole planetary taming business they seem so keen on. He opened the nutrient packet storage compartment and selected one at random. The label, once translated, read, "Protein Supplement 37B, formulated for carbon-based omnivores. Warning, contains trace elements of Jovian beetle extracts." Bon appetit, Daniel sighed, breaking the seal on the packet and preparing for his first meal on Deathworld Kl'hax. The nutrient packet tasted like a combination of unseasoned tofu and what Daniel imagined licking a battery might be like. Nevertheless, it was sustenance, and he forced himself to consume the entirety of its contents while reviewing the information Morga had secretly provided. The data chip contained a wealth of information that had been conspicuously absent from his official briefing. Kl'hax, it seemed, had not always been a death world. According to geological surveys conducted nearly 2 centuries earlier, the planet had once possessed a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere not dissimilar to Earth's, with liquid water oceans and even simple plant-like organisms. "So what happened to you?" Daniel murmured, scrolling through the reports. The answer came in a classified galactic survey report. Approximately 120 years ago, a mining corporation called Xerxes Extraction Enterprises had conducted experimental deep-core drilling on Kl'hax, seeking valuable mineral deposits. The drilling had apparently ruptured a massive pocket of methane hydrates deep beneath the surface, triggering a catastrophic environmental cascade. Within a decade, the planet's atmosphere had been overwhelmed by greenhouse gases, the oceans had acidified and eventually evaporated, and most indigenous life had perished. Rather than attempt restoration, a costly proposition with no immediate profit potential, Xerxes had simply classified the incident, abandoned their operation, and moved on to more viable worlds. The Galactic Council, either complicit or simply disinterested, had redesignated Kl'hax as a death world suitable for criminal rehabilitation projects. "So I'm cleaning up a corporate environmental disaster," Daniel said with a humorless laugh. "And here I thought my community service picking up highway trash back on Earth was tedious." The shelter's sensors chimed, alerting him to the onset of the nighttime temperature drop. Outside, the swirling yellow-green clouds darkened to a deep olive hue as the distant sun, a pale white dot barely visible through the toxic atmosphere, dipped below the horizon. Almost immediately, the temperature began to fall, the black sand freezing solid with audible cracking sounds. Daniel continued reviewing the data, paying particular attention to notes from previous planetary tamers, the condemned criminals, who had been sent here before him. Most entries were brief, desperate records of failed survival attempts. A Trelaxian biochemist had lasted 12 days before succumbing to equipment failure. A hegemon warrior had survived nearly 20 days by finding refuge in the cavern systems, only to encounter something in the depths that the report cryptically described as mobile and hostile. But one record stood out, a human scientist named Elena Winters, convicted of unauthorized genetic experimentation on protected species. She had survived for an impressive 43 days, establishing a functional outpost and even beginning preliminary atmospheric conversion before her life support systems had failed during a particularly violent storm. Most interestingly, Elena had investigated the same anomalous structure that Daniel's scanners had detected. Her notes described it as definitively artificial, predating Xerxes operations, purpose unknown, but architecture suggests non-galactic council origin. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the plummeting external temperature. If the structure wasn't built by the mining corporation and didn't match known galactic architectural styles, then who, or what, had constructed it? The mystery would have to wait until morning. The shelter's systems recommended a rest cycle to allow his body to acclimate to the planet's environmental conditions. Though reluctant to waste time sleeping, Daniel recognized the wisdom in preserving his strength. He activated the shelter's night mode, dimming the interior lights and extending the sleeping platform into a reasonably comfortable bed. As he lay down, the translucent dome above him revealed a surprising sight. As the toxic clouds temporarily thinned, a breathtaking array of stars became visible, more numerous and brilliant than he had ever seen on Earth. 3 small moons, each a different pale color, one amber, one blue, one almost pink, hung in the sky like festive ornaments. "Even death worlds have their moments," Daniel murmured as his exhaustion finally caught up with him, and he drifted into uneasy sleep beneath the alien sky. Morning on Kl'hax announced itself with a violent tremor that shook Daniel awake. The shelter swayed alarmingly but held firm, its flexible structure designed to withstand seismic activity. Outside, the black sand rippled in concentric patterns emanating from somewhere to the south, while the crystalline formations resonated with a high-pitched sound just at the edge of human hearing. Daniel checked the environmental monitors. The temperature had stabilized at a relatively comfortable 5 degrees Celsius, and the atmospheric toxicity levels, while still lethal, were at their daily minimum. If he was going to venture outside to investigate the mysterious structure, now would be the optimal time. "Day 2 of my illustrious career as a planetary tamer," Daniel announced to the empty shelter as he suited up. "Objectives: don't die, Check out the weird building, maybe plant a tree if there's time. He packed a portable scanner, sample collection equipment, and several emergency supply packets into a carry sack, then sealed his helmet and cycled through the airlock. The morning light on Kl'hax had a strange quality. Filtered through the toxic atmosphere, it cast everything in a sickly yellow-green glow that made depth perception challenging. Using the shelter's scanner as a reference, Daniel oriented himself toward the anomalous structure and began the trek across the treacherous terrain. The frozen black sand from the night before was now thawing, creating patches of treacherous semi-liquid that bubbled ominously. He carefully navigated around these areas, occasionally pausing to collect samples of interesting minerals or the strange luminescent organisms that pulsed beneath the surface. As he approached the location of the structure, the landscape changed, subtly. The random distribution of crystalline formations gave way to what appeared to be deliberately placed arrangements, not quite symmetrical, but exhibiting patterns that suggested intelligent design rather than natural formation. Curiouser and curiouser, Daniel muttered, recording the formations with his scanner. The structure itself came into view as he crested a small rise. Unlike the jagged, transparent crystals that dotted the landscape, this building, if that's what it was, appeared to be constructed of a dark, matte material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was roughly pyramidal in shape, but with sides that curved inward slightly, giving it an organic appearance. No visible entrances disrupted its smooth surface. Daniel approached cautiously, scanner extended before him. The readings were inconclusive. The material wasn't registering as any known element or compound in the database. More concerning was the complete absence of energy signatures or radiation of any kind. The structure seemed to exist in a state of perfect thermal and electromagnetic equilibrium with its surroundings, which was theoretically impossible. Okay, how do I get inside? Daniel wondered aloud, circling the structure. The answer came, unexpectedly. As he completed his circuit and returned to his starting point, he noticed a change. A seam had appeared in the previously seamless surface, extending from the apex to the ground. It widened as he watched, creating an opening just large enough for someone to enter. Daniel hesitated. Everything about this screamed trap, yet his curiosity was overwhelming. According to Elena Winter's notes, she had entered the structure and emerged unharmed, though her records of what she found inside were frustratingly vague. In for a penny, in for a pound, Daniel decided, activating his suit's recording functions and stepping through the opening. The interior was not what he expected. Rather than a dark, confined space, he found himself in what appeared to be a control room of some kind. The walls curved overhead to form a dome, and they were covered in what looked like organic circuitry, thin, bioluminescent lines that pulsed with a soft blue light. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with what was unmistakably an interface of some kind, a horizontal surface embedded with symbols that glowed the same blue as the wall circuitry. Most surprisingly, the atmosphere inside was breathable. His suit's sensors confirmed oxygen levels comparable to Earth standard, with no trace of the toxic gases that filled Kl'hax's atmosphere. The temperature was a comfortable 20 degrees Celsius. After a moment's hesitation, Daniel unsealed his helmet. The air smelled clean, but with an undertone of something like ozone, the smell of electrical equipment running at high capacity. "Hello?" he called out experimentally. His voice echoed slightly in the domed chamber. No response came, but the intensity of the blue light pulsing through the circuitry increased noticeably. The symbols on the interface pedestal shifted, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Daniel approached the pedestal cautiously, scanner still recording everything. The symbols were unlike any language he recognized, not standard galactic or any of the other major species' writing systems. They seemed to flow and change subtly even as he watched, as if alive or responding to his presence. On impulse, he reached out and touched one of the symbols. The reaction was immediate and startling. The symbol beneath his fingertip flared brightly, and the entire room seemed to come alive with increased luminescence. A sound filled the chamber. Not quite mechanical, not quite organic, something between a hum and a pulse that he felt in his chest, as much as heard with his ears, and then, most astonishingly, words appeared, floating in the air before him in perfectly legible English. Interface established. Genetic pattern recognized. Welcome, Terraformer. Daniel stared at the floating text, momentarily speechless. Finally, he managed to ask, "What are you?" The text shifted, the words flowing and reforming. "I am Restoration Protocol Alpha. I was created to heal damaged worlds." "You're some kind of terraforming system?" Daniel asked, his mind racing with possibilities. "Correct. I was deployed on this world 732 cycles ago when catastrophic environmental damage was detected. I have been awaiting activation by a qualified operator." Daniel frowned. 732 cycles. Is that local years? Who deployed you? The symbols on the pedestal shifted again and the text reformed. Cycles translate to approximately 127 of your Earth years. I was deployed by the Caretakers. You are the first compatible operator to locate this facility since deployment. The Caretakers? Daniel asked. I don't know who that is. And why am I compatible? What makes me a qualified operator? Information regarding the Caretakers is restricted until full authentication. Your genetic pattern matches parameters. For basic operation, full functionality requires authentication and integration. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, mind reeling with the implications. This facility predated the mining disaster that had ruined Kl'hax. It had been placed here specifically to repair environmental damage by some unknown entity called the Caretakers, and had been waiting all this time for someone like him to activate it. So you can fix this planet? He asked, hardly daring to believe it. Affirmative. Kl'hax can be restored to Class 1 habitability within 17 cycles with proper implementation of restoration protocols. Daniel let out a low whistle. That would be quite the twist to my sentence, from condemned criminal to planetary savior. A thought occurred to him. What do you mean by integration? The text hesitated before responding, the symbols on the pedestal swirling more rapidly. Integration requires biological interface between operator and system. Procedure is non-reversible, but non-harmful. Integration allows full access to all restoration protocols and caretaker archives. Non-reversible sounds pretty permanent, Daniel observed cautiously. What exactly does this biological interface entail? Neural connection, your consciousness, would remain autonomous but would gain access to system functions. Your physical form would remain unchanged. Daniel paced around the pedestal, considering his options. This was far beyond what he had expected to find on Kl'hax. If this restoration protocol Alpha was legitimate, he could actually fulfill his sentence of taming the planet, not in the futile, doomed-to-fail manner the Galactic Council had intended, but genuinely transforming it back into a habitable world. On the other hand, allowing an unknown alien technology to create a neural connection with his brain seemed like the kind of decision that featured prominently in horror stories about technology gone wrong. What happened to the previous human who found this place? Elena Winters? He asked. Elena Winters discovered this facility but was genetically incompatible. She attempted manual override of compatibility protocols. Attempt failed. She departed. Without achieving integration, that explained the vagueness in Elena's notes. She hadn't been able to activate the system. Daniel took a deep breath. If I agree to this integration, what exactly would I be able to do? The text shifted again, this time accompanied by a holographic display that materialized above the pedestal. A three-dimensional model of Kl'hax, showing its current state and then transitioning through stages of transformation until it depicted a verdant world with blue oceans and white clouds. Full integration grants control of atmospheric processors, molecular restructuring arrays, and biogenetic seeding protocols. You would oversee the complete ecological restoration of Kl'hax. Daniel watched the simulation cycle through again, mesmerized by the transformation. From death world to paradise, all through technology so advanced it might as well be magic to him. And all I have to do is agree to this neural connection. Affirmative. Initialization requires verbal consent and physical contact with the primary interface node. The pedestal shifted, revealing a small depression in its center containing what appeared to be a crystalline object unlike the formations. Outside, this one pulsed with the same blue luminescence as the circuitry throughout the chamber. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, weighing his options. Death was almost certain if he returned to his shelter and continued with the Galactic Council's version of planetary taming. Even with the mysterious facility's breathable atmosphere, as a refuge his supplies would eventually run out. And if he somehow survived, he'd still be a prisoner of the system that had condemned him to this fate. But accepting the integration meant stepping into the unknown, binding himself to alien technology he didn't understand, deployed by entities he'd never heard of. What would happen if I left without integrating? Would you just keep waiting for the next compatible person? Correct. This facility will remain dormant until a compatible operator initiates integration. Time is irrelevant to the waiting protocol. Daniel took another deep breath, decision crystallizing in his mind. Well, I did come here to tame a planet, just didn't expect to have help. He stepped forward, placing his hand above the depression containing the crystal. I consent to integration with Restoration Protocol Alpha. The crystal flared with brilliant blue light. Before Daniel could react, it rose from its depression and pressed against his palm. He felt a momentary sharp pain, like a static shock but more intense, and then knowledge flooded his consciousness. Information about atmospheric composition, molecular restructuring techniques, biogenetic engineering principles, concepts he had never studied suddenly became as familiar as his own name. He understood exactly how Kl'hax had been damaged and precisely how to heal it. More than that, he sensed the planetary systems around him, the toxic atmosphere, the damaged soil biology, the dormant seed banks deep beneath the surface waiting for the right conditions to spring back to life. He could feel the network of restoration nodes that had been placed strategically around the planet, all connected to this central facility, all waiting for his command to begin their work. As the initial overwhelming rush of information subsided, Daniel opened eyes he hadn't realized he'd closed. The room looked the same, but his perception of it had fundamentally changed. He could now read the symbols on the pedestal as easily as English, could sense the energy flows through the organic circuitry, could access any function of the facility with a mere thought. That was intense, he said aloud, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The text that had been floating before him was gone, replaced by a direct communication in his mind. Integration complete. Welcome, Terraformer Daniel Roberts. Shall we begin restoration procedures? Daniel smiled, a plan already forming in his mind not just for restoring Kl'hax, but for what would come after. Yes, he replied, placing both hands on the pedestal. Let's heal this world. Within hours of Daniel's integration with the restoration protocol, Kl'hax began to change. The process started subtly. Atmospheric processors hidden beneath the surface activated, beginning the long task of filtering methane and hydrogen sulfide from the air and replacing it with nitrogen and oxygen. The crystalline formations that dotted the landscape revealed themselves to be more than mere geological curiosities. They were actually biological filtration matrices, designed to absorb toxins and convert them into harmless compounds. Through his newfound connection to the system, Daniel directed these activities with intuitive ease. The knowledge implanted in his mind during integration allowed him to understand the complex ecological interrelationships at play and to make adjustments as needed. It was like conducting an orchestra where each instrument was a different aspect of planetary science. By the end of the first day, sensors detected a measurable decrease in atmospheric toxicity within a 5-kilometer radius of the main facility. By the end of the first week, that radius had expanded to 50 kilometers. Small patches of black sand began to lighten in color as buried seed stalks, dormant for over a century, received the chemical signals they had been waiting for and began to germinate. Daniel spent most of his time in the facility, which he had come to think of as the restoration hub. Through its systems,